So I was just mentioning and talking about the kind of intellectual and background and training that Alexander of Macedon uh, would have had, or what he did have with Aristotle, and um, when he was being exposed to military might, power, mysticism, and um, rational philosophy. Okay, and notice this here. Plutarch, you might recognize that name if you looked on the discussion in your textbook. The achievement of Alexander the Great, different voices. The one There's the one section there. The first source is actually Plutarch as well. Um, but Aristotle, he says, advise Alexander to treat the Greeks as if he were their leader and other peoples as if he were their master. To have regard for the Greeks as for friends and kindred, but to conduct himself toward other peoples as though they were plants and animals. You know, I want you to think about this observation made by Plutarch. Then, when you look at your textbook and you take a look on page 118 and the section where it says a Greek biographer celebrates the cultural achievement of Alexander the Great, where he talks about how he basically convinced Persians not to marry their mothers but to respect them. I would put money that the Persians didn't marry their mothers. I think that what you are seeing again is not an accurate way of looking at other peoples in terms of what they're about, but a way of what you do to celebrate being an imperial master. And he's making moral justifications for what he's doing. If you've ever heard of the poem "The White Man's Burden" by Rudyard Kipling, um, you should look at that. It's basically him. He's the one who made the Jungle Book, by the way, the story, and Ricky Tikki Taffy. But he justifies British colonialism as the white man's burden is to civilize and tame all of the brown people in the world. And the language seems so just outrageous to us now. Hopefully, it seems outrageous. Although Michael Savage one time read it on the radio when I was driving with seriousness that I was a little bit shocked that people were still reading that and um, taking it serious and agreeing with the sentiments of the poem. I really did hear Michael Savage do that. White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. Again, I'm bringing it back because what I like to do is I like to tie in more modern history and the legacy of Western civilization into where we get a lot of ideas from. Um, and I think that the Greek philosophies of slavery, the ideas about a master race in a sense, right, and about how to look at your inferiors in terms of them being lower, and then a civilizing mission that we see Plutarch talks about in the textbook, to justify, morally, dominating other people. That's something we should think about. I mean, we went to war in Iraq, just for example, and again, not to try to play on a political line of that, is called Operation Iraqi Freedom. Now, Iraq didn't attack us in 9/11. That's stated by George Bush. There was potentially weapons of mass destruction there that most people claim, like the UN, that they didn't have, and in fact they didn't, but they didn't use them on the United States. And we went to war, and it was called not in defense of the United States, but Iraqi freedom, as if the war was for the Iraqis. Think about that. Operation Iraqi Freedom. We're told on one hand the rhetoric was we're securing ourselves, but the idea is that Saddam was evil and that we could make Iraq a better place. Now, I'll let you decide if you buy into that. But do you see the similarity of the style of rhetoric and the arguments being cast the way that they are? And so when I'm talking about the legacy of the Greeks and Aristotle and Alexander the Great and all these ideas, I don't think it's a stretch to see a continuity of how things are said and done. So that's just my thought. You can take it or leave it. That's what I wanted to point out. All right. So aside from the rhetoric, there was actual facts on the ground, which was the style of fighting. That's always really, Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist, said political power comes from the barrel of a gun. Well, back then it was maybe the length of your staff, or Anyways, this phalanx that you read about, this is a picture of it. Can you imagine being in the front, facing down this thing on, over here? Wow. So the Macedonian phalanx was a fighting formation that really gave them an advantage. And this is where Philip, Alexander's father, and Alexander the Great were able to utilize something that would give them a tremendous advantage. And so if you look in this picture here, there would be the phalanx, you'd have the light infantry, and then the light cavalry here. I mean, can you imagine facing this down? They clearly had an advantage with this, and so the military strategy is ultimately what gave them the advantage. All right, so just some of the things I want to highlight. We have some battles that were significant for Alexander the Great, and he basically was showing the Persians that he was going to make revenge for what happened 150 years earlier. So backing up, as we remember also that the Greeks were victims of Persian imperialism. They were the underdogs, and they win, and that unifies them, and it creates a kind of unified Greek identity, or a sense of it. And that history, as you saw in that very kind of vulgar vase that I showed, was an example of how the motif of the Persian becomes the quintessential kind of image or enemy of the Greeks. And so it would be easy for Alexander the Great to want to have a unifying force in which to bring people, Greeks under his influence, to battle a common enemy that they all grew up on, those Persians. Remember what they did way back in the day, as we've been passing down from generation to generation. And here's the excuse to go in. And again, we see that used in war all the time. If you look at a lot of conflicts that Milosevic used in the Serbian war, and just so many places, people who are familiar with regional conflicts and histories that take them back can use those as an excuse to maybe actually be the aggressor, when maybe they were the victims a long time ago, and now they want a chance to do it. But this was also a time of competing empires. Persia's trying to dominate some nations. Now the Greeks are wanting to dominate some nations. Who's the victim and who's the aggressor? Are they all aggressors? What about the small nations caught in the middle of it? So these are all things to just kind of think on. In any case, the Persians that were dominating the world were facing a new enemy that was coming at them very strong. And so we see that going into the Middle East, to Syria and Palestine and Egypt, is going to be significant too, especially certain aspects to our history. And the Greek legacy into Syria, Palestine, and Egypt will have an effect on Christianity, because it has an effect on the Jews. And as we've just talked about, the ancient Hebrews are also a major influence on our society. We're going to get to all of that in this lecture. So I'm going to highlight a little bit more of that in different ways than the textbook was even talking about. So I'll end here.